start recording.
Awesome. Cool. And what I'll do is I'll pull up the questions on Slido. Hey guys, welcome back to our second session on what's happening. We'll give folks a minute or so to dial in. And meanwhile, I'm going to share my screen and pull up the questions folks have posted on Slido. And sorry. And we'll get started. Serena, I can share my screen?
Yes, you should be able to.
Okay. All right, wow, we're at close to about 50 people. So I think let's get going. So welcome everyone. This is our part 2 of our multi-part series around trying to make sense of the world. So much has changed over the last week. Everything from, if you look at across three dimensions, whether it's on the health perspective with, the overall social justice angle, or with the stock market. So without further ado, I'm going to ask our panelists to sort of dive deeper, and you guys should see questions on the screen. We'll have, please feel free as audience, please feel free to add more questions as we go along. And I will pass the mic on to Sudeep to start off and sort of dilate further into what's happening in the COVID world.
Sure. Thanks, Shuja, and thanks everyone for attending. I've certainly gotten a lot of questions throughout this pandemic, and certainly over the last few weeks, about new cases, increases as a result of reopening of states, and whether protests and crowding are contributing to that, and whether there's a new second wave that we're in right now, or whether we can anticipate a second wave and what we should do about it. And I guess there are a few ways to answer this question. And the first thing I wanted to do is talk about the data that we currently have and where the data can lead us, and really where the data can mislead us. And I wanted to make that distinction. As you know, total cases this week in the US surpassed 2 million and surpassed 114,000 deaths. In the US, we're still tallying up about 20,000 new cases each day. And it's been above 20,000 or so new cases each day since the end of March. And so for many individuals, that alone is concerning, despite that there have been declines in a lot of the hardest hit states. So declines in New York, New Jersey, Washington, some parts of California. So despite that, the concern is that that's being offset by increases in numbers of cases in states like Arizona and Florida, North and South Carolina, and some of the other southern states, as well as Puerto Rico. And so, the issue is partly that certainly more tests are available. So more people are being tested, we're going to catch more cases. So we would expect case counts overall to increase. However, by many metrics, the actual increases in cases across the US, particularly in the South and in Arizona, those increases exceed what we would expect just by increased testing capacity alone. And so in my view, the better numbers to look at so there are a few numbers. The first would be cases per capita. And that's very messy data. I have to say that at times has been pretty misleading. In fact, there were reports early this week of states like Virginia and Texas and Vermont actually reporting what were felt to be fairly distorted numbers, because they combined in their case numbers the two different types of tests that are used. So the nasal swab, which detects for active infection, as well as the antibody test, which detect prior infection. So they bundled all that together and reported those to try to show that their testing capacity was large, and thus the number of cases were pretty low. And some felt that it was, whether it was intentional or not, it artificially inflated the testing capacity. And so the states that we know that have the highest rates per capita include Louisiana, Illinois, Iowa, and Nebraska. and some other states on the eastern seaboard. So the cases per capita is messy data, and hopefully as we start garnering the right kind of tests to get that data, we know what the denominator is and we can properly calculate it. But the other important number is really the fraction of tests that are positive. That's one of the numbers that's concerning to me, because that's an indication of growth rate. So in the early stages of the pandemic, the fraction of tests that we were doing that were positive were above 20%. Since at that time, we were only testing high-risk people, symptomatic people. It stayed there for several weeks, and then it declined over ensuing weeks in April and May to below 5%. And so in late May, it was about 4.5%, and now it's remained 4.5% since early June, and there are some signs that that percentage is increasing and creeping up slightly. And so that's concerning to me. If we were really just expanding testing, then we would expect the fraction of positives to be decreasing, not plateauing or increasing. And then the bigger concern on top of that is that in some states, it's wildly increasing. For example, in Georgia, they're now at 10% of their tests that are positive, and that's more than double the national average. And in South Carolina, they tripled their rates from 3% to 9%, and Texas is seeing spikes in prisoners and meatpacking workers. So there are increases in a lot of places, and that is buried in some of that data. And finally, the fatalities per day. I think that's a more important number overall. That's also concerning. So we saw peaks at the peak of our pandemic in the US at about 2,500 deaths per day in mid to late April as things surged in New York and Louisiana, LA. And then a very slow decline to around 800 to 1,200 deaths per day. But in recent weeks, the lowest was 373, and now we're back up to about 900 to 1,000 new deaths per day. And that's worrisome. What it implies is that we're either diagnosing new people we wouldn't have caught before, and then they are subsequently dying, or it's reflecting people that were infected 2-3 weeks ago when things started happening, when we started reopening, when protests started, and we're seeing the consequences of that. So some of the numbers that are more data-driven for me are pretty concerning. And the last thing I would say is that this is not, in my view, the second wave. This is a limited increase in specific regions. It's not the widespread resurgence of community-wide transmission that we would see in things like flu. Will there be a second wave in the fall? I do believe so, based on other seasonal respiratory viruses, and it'll come along with flu and the other seasonal viruses. It will, in my view, be modest compared to the first, and we will be better prepared at that time with testing, triaging, and tracing and treatments, and hopefully on our way to having a vaccine.
Cool. Well, thanks, Sudhir. And I'm sure there are a lot of other questions which are coming up, and we'll get to it in the audience portion of the questions. And I'm going to ask Atif to sort of talk about more what's happening in sort of the markets from Fed interventions. And it seems as if there's infinite capacity to not only print money, but also no assets are off the limits. So what's happening from the broader macro perspective, and where are we headed, Atif?
Yeah, so the Fed is sort of maxed out on the dimensions that the Fed can act. And as Chairman Powell said recently in his remarks, he's not even thinking about raising rates, right? So that tells you something about the mindset that is there at the Fed, and for sort of understandable reasons given the state of the economy at some level. But I think the way to think of the Fed question is it has to be balanced with what is happening on the fiscal side, in terms of what Congress is doing or has been doing and how it has been acting. And I think I said this last time as well, that one of the core problems with the US at the macro level has been that it has had a very imbalanced economy for a long time that has shown up in things like the high level of inequality, among other things. And that has led to a situation where you have needed artificial measures to support aggregate demand, because the fact of the matter is that people at the very top end of the distribution, while they have been earning more and more as a share of the pie, they have not been spending that to the same degree in terms of spending power, and real investment has not increased. So that has over time led to this depressed aggregate demand that has always acted as a headwind for the economy. The thing with this crisis is that headwind has accelerated. Why? Because partly this shock has increased inequality in the sense that those who are at the lower end of the distribution have suffered more, number one. Number two, and perhaps even more importantly, one of the big impacts of this COVID crisis has been this sense of fear, which I think, I'm guessing that at least over 90% of people on the call are spending less than they typically used to. And so for various reasons. And so our, we are not spending as much. And that, precautionary saving effect has really been extraordinary to watch in the aggregate in the US. Now, that is not good. When everyone tries to save at a significant level, that is not good for the overall economy. And that's the big headwind for aggregate demand that I'm talking about. So given that headwind, other institutions need to act, and Fed is one of those institutions that has tried to act as much as it can. But we do need sort of the fiscal side to step in as well. So what is really looking forward in the next month to 2 months, what is really important and needs to be looked at very carefully are the headwinds that are going to come up as the UI benefits start to sort of go off ramp. So there's going to be a serious question of, is the Congress going to come back and sort of provide additional support through another stimulus measure or not? I think that's going to be very important over the next few months. And the other big question mark is going to be with the state and local governments. Just to give you one additional data point, if you look at the most recent employment report, which was much more positive than people had anticipated and led to a huge rally in the stock market before, of course, what happened more recently, that relatively positive employment report actually had a negative aspect to it, which is if you look at the employment numbers coming from state and local governments, you start to see them laying off workers. And there are no employment gains in that segment, which is really worrying because state and local governments, they have this balanced budget amendment and all of that. So they need support in the next few months, and that's going to be a big political issue in DC, and is going to have an impact at the macro level. So overall, I think things are quite fragile at the macro level, and for everything that they've said on the health side is going to have an impact on the economy. I think we have seen a lot of evidence, very convincing evidence, that regardless of what the government says in terms of lockdown or no lockdown, if the virus is spreading, that has implications of its own for the economy. And people, for obvious reasons, stop going out, they stop spending as much, and so on. So really, this is a COVID crisis. The virus is front and center. That has to be brought under control. We are going to wait for the vaccine, but before that, it's really up to preventing the spread. People need to wear masks when they're outside and all of that stuff. So so I think things are very much up in the air in terms of we're certainly not on the path to recovery with any certainty. So you're going to see a lot of volatility, and they're going to be it's state contingent in the sense that we do need to see how the government acts, and they need to support unemployment insurance, things of that sort, and they need to support local and state governments. I think those are the key two things where that directly involve the government.
All right. I think we're going to go into deeper questions. Meanwhile, I'm going to make sure my wife doesn't hear your talk about going out and spending. I'm keeping the credit cards away from her. So, so when we go from macro to a little bit more micro, Abid, if you could sort of dilate into sort of what's happening from your perspective in both in sort of at a micro level, savings, how how can companies stimulate growth as well?
Look, for me, I guess, kind of building on what Dave and Atif said, I think if you look at what's happening in the overall economy right now, we may all live in one country, but we definitely, could easily be living in two very different worlds, right? And I'm not talking about right and the left. I'm also talking about the haves and the have-nots. And I think there's a big distinction there, right? So I think if you think about what is happening in the overall economy, and you focus on what can spur investment or spending in general, right? You have to have the ability to spend and you have to have the propensity to spend. And I think what's happening right now is if you look at the haves of the world, they have the ability to spend, they also have the propensity to spend. The question is, what are they going to be spending their money on? And they may not be going out to the restaurants, but they definitely are buying, plenty of expensive stocks. They're buying plenty of expensive artwork. You would think somebody would have more social sense than this, but Ken Griffin of Citadel kind of fame went out and bought $100 million art piece just in, I guess last week. So you've got definitely the haves and the have-nots. Now you move to the have-nots, right? Look at the have-nots, their ability to spend has been really badly hurt too, right? As Atif said earlier, it's usually it's people at the bottom of that inequality spectrum whose wages and whose employment has been impacted the most. As a result, they have the ability to spend is limited. And the propensity to spend obviously is also limited because for all the same reasons that we just talked about, whether it's, even if you had the money, people don't want to go out to a local restaurant, right? They don't want to go out to the local mom and pop retail store, which may even be closed for the time being. So there is all of that, which means that overall the economy remains a little bit weak. And I know you had asked Shuja earlier for me to comment a little bit on the stock market too, and I saw that there's some questions coming up on that front. I wear a couple of hats. So I wear the operational hat for Arizona, but then I also run the family office for the entrepreneur's family. So we do follow this type of stuff pretty closely, and we kind of look at the entire spectrum. And I think as far as the stock market's concerned, we can spend the next 6 hours talking about it. So I'm going to try and keep it as short as I can. Look, the stock market, or as Kashif has said in the last webinar, the TenYear, some of these metrics were always a measure of how well the economy is doing and what is a willing buyer and a willing seller willing to transact something at and a reflection of value. I think what we have now done, whether it's the Fed, whether it's other participants in the economy, we are beginning to target the measures. So when the measure becomes a target, it cannot be a measure anymore. So when, if the stock market drops by 10%, you have our Federal Reserve Chairman coming out saying that the market isn't functioning properly. But if it goes up 10%, then that's all good, right? That's somehow, so there's a little bit of an asymmetric treatment to how the stock market's trading. And what you're seeing is, and again, going back full circle to the point about have and have nots, if you look at the haves and their propensity to spend, a lot of them are sitting at home and they think that the stock market only goes up. And there's a lot of what I would view as irrational exuberance that's going on in the stock market right now. And again, please, always take what I say about investments or what anybody says about investments with a grain of salt, right? As Yogi Berra once said, it's very hard to make predictions, particularly about the future. So, just take that with a grain of salt. But if you look at by any measure, whether it's PE, whether it's price to cash flow, price to book, if you look at the amount of leverage that is still in the system, whether at the sovereign level or the corporate level, or for that matter, even at the individual level, it's a little bit scary right now. So again, we can, I'm sure, follow up with some specific questions, but overall, in my personal opinion, I think we're in slightly frothy conditions.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your perspective. And I think Rohini does take a much longer future-based outlook and tries to make bets which would sort of pan out 5, 10, 15 years out. So Rohini, what are you seeing in the private markets?
Yeah. So, and I'll narrow that down to sort of the venture markets, and maybe I'll add a few comments to set it up to see what's going on. And then we can take some questions on it. So I pulled some data for May. And if you look at the private markets, May saw $6.3 billion in funding for startups. So this is seed, Series A, Series B, and C. That was 32% over April, but 15% down year over year versus last May. So, I mean, we're still seeing the effects of COVID, but relatively speaking, I think people are learning how to do deals over Zoom and, do your diligence. And even anecdotally, we're hearing about people doing essentially doing the diligence over Zoom. They're coming to terms with the fact that maybe you won't get to meet entrepreneurs as much. Of those, there were 95 deals 95 deals that were seed for $300 million, and 82 Series A's, 43 Series B's, and 46 C+. So the C+ rounds, which are like the growth rounds, were still very strong, 100 million. The median round was over $100 million. In general, there's been a little bit of a decline in the number of Series A deals, as well as the dollar investment in any of those rounds. So, that's usually an indicator that, people want to get these deals done, and they're willing to accept a little bit less. Everybody's feeling uncertainty, but it still is a relatively healthy market. Some of the new investments that we have been tracking, I think there was a question around what happens post-COVID. I think there are sort of the obvious themes that are coming up, which is around remote work and telemedicine and so on. And we are continuing to see deals that are happening in that space. We saw Headspace raise $72 million. So I think mental health is going to be an issue coming out of COVID. Calm raised a bunch of money before that as well. So I think the obvious ones are going to get funded first. So remote work, doing events over Zoom or other, remote entertainment, remote fitness. There's no question that if there is something obvious, go fund that first, and then let's think of the second order effects after that. In terms of my own area, so I invest a lot in enterprise infrastructure and enterprise apps. We've been living through like a huge expansion of the cloud and so on. And I think, as we talked about last week, we see the infrastructure build continue. If anything, our lives would have been pretty terrible if we didn't have robust internet infrastructure. And I don't know if I shared this stat last time, but there was a report that said AT&T's network, they saw as we cut over to post-COVID, they saw their traffic go up 71 petabytes per day. Like there was like a step function increase, not petabytes. So 71, and now I'm gonna miss the unit, but think of it as petabytes per day or whatever that equivalent is. And the equivalent of all of the traffic in the network in 2014 was 58. So just the delta as we cut over from pre-COVID to post-COVID in March was higher than all of the traffic that they were carrying in 2014. So I think the infrastructure build that we're going to see and how critical it has been to people continuing to work and the economy continuing to function, that's pretty apparent. So we are definitely seeing this as an area where there should be strong investment, and that's all the way from hardware infrastructure all the way going up to now various layers of abstraction and how you make software productive and all of this stuff. So we can talk more about that if there are questions. And then the last thing I wanted to touch on is, there is of course a lot of discussion in the venture world about diversity and the lack of especially Black founders and Black VCs. There are fewer than 2% of founders are Black, and fewer than 1% of VCs are Black. So these are like atrociously bad numbers. We thought we didn't have enough women. Now it turns out we have even less representation in terms of Black VCs and so on. And so there's been a big discussion around that. I signed on to a pledge that was led by Jonathan Heiliger at Vertex. There are 70 VCs who have signed on to a pledge to do office hours. And so I am putting that in the chat box here. So if you do know Black founders who would like to have office hours with VCs, there are 70 VCs who are signed up to doing that. And it's really about advice. But as you know, in the venture world, if you want money, you ask for advice. If you want advice, ask for money. And so I think there's the whole discussion around inequality, which we're having right now, as well as the lack of equal opportunity, has been something that's been quite a topic of discussion in the last couple of weeks. And in, predating that, we went through the whole Me Too movement and the lack of representation and how it shows up in weird ways in AI, for example. So, if you don't have people of color and people and women working on some of these technologies, you can have some weird downstream effects, and which we all want to avoid. So I think that's, so it's been I think overall May was a month where we felt like, well, maybe this isn't as bad as we expected it was. Everybody's bracing for the second wave. Everybody's bracing to see if PPP runs out and unemployment goes up, what that means for the private markets. So for now, the safe areas seem to be, all the remote things, because, we formed new habits. The safe areas seem to be home delivery. Everybody loves getting things home and they're willing to pay more. So I think people are just investing in more of the things that feel more obvious right now, and there might be other things that come behind that.
Got it. Thanks, Rohini. And I think Pega, I think if you go zoom in, zoom down into further what part of what Rohini was saying was around sort of remote working, and there are other areas, teams, and we'll touch on that later on. But I think to the extent that in the remote work team, what are you seeing from your perspective, and what are the implications
we can go down some investment areas there, but I think one of the interesting things is if you look at spring 2020, it's going to have a cultural impact in the US, in the world, and in companies everywhere. So companies where their culture was really premised around the campus, what replaces that, right? What's the culture impact for those companies that we'll be telling? And on one front, and the macro culture impact will be, purpose and meaning matter more to us right now as humans than they probably did in January. No question. I mean, you could see it, how people get behind causes and want to make an impact. So it's this interesting dichotomy where it's like people want to have more impact and purpose, and at the same time, the connection with company is a little bit less, right? And the first order problems at the beginning was the first 100 days. Look, we've been around the 100 days. I don't know what day we are in, but close to it. The first 100 days were about, let's get up as companies, let's get up and running, and allowing everyone to do the work. But a lot of the mission, the purpose, all those things were embedded in the companies. The next 100 days, it's going to be about where do we go from here, and how can we harness the benefits that look, there was negatives and there's benefits. We saw certain things you could do at different places, and you could have a lot more digital footprint that makes things better. And how could we use that and also realize the challenges? So I think in the next 100 days, what companies do, it's going to impact their culture in 2021, 22, 23, no doubt. And so I think the one thing that's going to keep coming up is how do companies that were used to maintaining culture and the velocity of their company in certain ways maintain that. And I think that is going to become a bigger factor over time. It's almost going to become a bigger problem than the initial technology challenges at the beginning. And if you, as a company, the company, you want alignment, you have to provide purpose. If you want accountability, you need to have clarity. If you want your company to be innovating more, you need to still inspire people, right? If you want speed, you need your team to be enthusiastic. So maintaining those while having more of a distributed workforce is going to be important. And I don't know if we want to touch on one of the questions I saw on the first page you had was about measuring productivity. I think one of the interesting things about, now all of us are a combination of working from home and different places. So the work life and personal life have become intertwined. I mean, we all talk about it on every call we have, right? And so someone's on dad duty, mom duty, what's expected of us. So our time availability is, we're working a lot more hours, but we need to be also as workers thinking about working more independently and asynchronously. And so the dynamic requires a shift from companies evaluating time spent to someone quoted strong time potency at work, right? It's not about how much time you spent, but about how potent you were in that time you spent and being able to do that. And the way you do that is by driving a lot more accountability and knowing exactly what your purpose is and what you're supposed to do. So I think it's going to be an interesting time for companies. The companies that are going to be able to be as fast and evolve are going to get those factors right, and they're going to figure out how do they train their managers to create that sense in their teams. And especially for large companies, it's even more important because the dynamic ends up impacting a lot of parts of the business. So I think and I have some ideas there, but we can dive into it later as the questions come. But I think measuring potency will become very important.
Yeah.
And nobody wants to be measured by time anymore, right? Nobody wants to say, oh, I worked 10 hours a day and I was really productive.
Yeah, so it's going to have interesting impacts on businesses like, Cisco's collaboration, where you are collaborating in real time, right? So, yeah. So let's go into the audience questions. I know there are tons of questions which have come in. Some we may have already touched base on it already, but the top question from the audience right now is, what can we do as an MIT community to authentically be more anti-racist in our actions and behaviors versus just reading and reflection, right? So I know, Rohini, you touched base on that a little bit, and I don't know if others want to chime in on this, but this has been a sort of top of mind for a lot of folks over the course of the last week, 2 weeks.
Yeah, I think,
okay,
yeah, so, sorry. Yeah, I guess, in our corner of the world, as I mentioned, it's pretty lopsided. So in some ways the only way to go is up from here. So, where we have been, and this has been true even from the Me Too movement, and there's a group called All Raise, which is trying to have more women venture capitalists raise funds and trying to help even out the partner mix. And the whole idea is that it is a network-based business, whether you like it or not, and you kind of have to seed that network, and that's where it can grow from there. So the types of things that are helpful is, one is just in our daily practice, be very mindful. And we run diversity slates for hiring amongst our portfolio companies, and I think we're going to do that with, so for both for women as well as in terms of access to people from other backgrounds. I think the office hours that I mentioned, but I think the most important thing that we could do is to enable people to build their own businesses, and I think that's true for Black founders as well. What I've really struggled with is, to be honest, and this is sort of a personal thing, is I'm not an anarchist. I'm sort of somebody who's in the or an activist even. I'm sort of somebody who is, for better or for worse, in the system. Somebody who follows the system, and you can really get into this whole status quo mode and feeding the status quo. And this is sort of an activist moment, and it's really it's a muscle that I haven't used very well, right? And so for me, it's much more about what can we do from a systemic perspective that may have impact. But I would love to get people's thoughts on it and advice on what we could be doing that can be impactful in this area.
Right. Atif, you were about to sort of dilate on that.
Yeah, I just wanted to say one thing very quickly. I think on the MIT question, the thing to focus on is what can MIT do institutionally as a community that will be most help. And I think there is an interesting play here potentially with MIT interacting with technology and making a large impact. And I'm just going to give one example of that, which is a very promising initiative started by MIT, which is called MicroMasters. And those of you who have not looked at it, just Google it and look up what MicroMasters is. The basic idea is that you can take kind of these online courses in few different fields like data science, economics, and so on. Anyone can do it sitting in Bangladesh, wherever, and so on. But you could imagine sort of doing that in communities that typically underrepresented in places like MIT. But the idea is to really motivate the young to kind of study on their own and to really find the diamonds in the rough and then bring them on campus to MIT. And I think it's a great, it's something that can really expand. And what all of us can do as a sort of MIT alumni and so on is kind of, use those tools and in our local community. So, whether it's, for me, there is reaching out to people in Trenton, New Jersey, and, high schools there and so on, and saying, look, you can actually take advantage of this, and, you can really get the talent from these communities and then take them to the next level. So I just want to highlight something like that. I think there's a lot of promise out there using this interplay of technology with reputation of a place like MIT.
Wow, that's such a great suggestion.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Like try and like sort of mobilize resources and get people to sort of spread the word. So excellent. Yes, so Dave?
Yeah, I was hoping I could add a health and maybe public health perspective to this also, and it's partly about taking advantage of this moment, really. As we talked about last week, a lot of the health disparities, it's not, this is larger than just racism. This is the underlying inequities in this country. The health disparities have certainly come to the forefront as a result of COVID-19, where there's a lot of media attention now regarding the unequal infection rates and outcomes and deaths among Blacks and Latinos. And those disparities in health have been present for almost the entire modern Western healthcare system. Those have been around a lot longer than COVID-19, but right now is the moment where these have come to the forefront of national dialogue in a way that's never been reported on before. So while the disparities have existed, now I feel we have a moment to at least grasp the attention of different communities. And the two examples that I would bring up as to how we can help address some of these disparities in an attempt to balance out some of the inequities are, number one, there is a lot of innovation to try to address healthcare inequity. And a lot of that revolves around telemedicine and targeting and identifying certain risk groups. And now there are a lot of companies that have pivoted toward trying to do just that, not just enable COVID testing, but enable telemedicine for all. That has really balanced a lot of the playing field, I would say. And there's certainly a lot of innovation and access issues that still can be addressed. And so that would be the first thing, I think, is that technology and the things that MIT alums particularly are very good at can now be balanced and taking advantage of this moment to help address some of these inequities. And the second thing is that unfortunately, we will see that as we convert to a work from home environment, there will be those who can never work from home. And those will be white collar workers, blue collar workers primarily. And those individuals will still be back to work and probably have higher risks of acquiring infection. And so the extent to which we can leverage technology and the tools that we have to enable work from home from individuals who don't find it so easy, I think that that's another way to address what is going to be a widening gap if we don't seize the moment.
So while we have you, Steve, if you want to just touch base on this second question around work from home and sort of second closure and how cities will evolve with population density and being a liability. Mm-hmm. And if you have any perspectives on that.
Yeah, it's a very good question. So I'm assuming that implied in that question, second wave closure means another national lockdown, which I think is fairly unlikely, partly because of some of the reasons that I mentioned before, that things will be different the second time around. I don't think the rates will be as high. There will be some immune protection in the population, and we will be better prepared as far as testing. We will even probably be able to implement contact tracing. A lot of organizations and companies right now are actually using technology and wearables and these kinds of devices to track individuals who may have been exposed or may be infected. And that's certainly a gap in contact tracing that we were blindsided by when we were hit by the pandemic at the end of January, but I think we'll be better prepared the next time. So I feel that the second wave will be very different, and it won't require a national lockdown of this scale. But I do feel that there will be ingrained in our society now the concepts of distancing, quarantine, isolating, and masks, certainly. And I do want to touch on that because, a few months ago, there were a lot of controversies around wearing masks and whether it would even work. And the guidance at that time was, don't wear a mask because, it doesn't protect you. It potentially could protect others, but we just don't have the data. And then the guidance changed, and it was largely because we knew we could no longer contain the pandemic. We had to mitigate it. And at that time, I remember I worked on a piece with Huffington Post to help guide best practices on making masks at home. You can make them out of HEPA filter, vacuum bags and grocery bags and that sort of thing. And my friends, I remember texting me throughout that day saying, is this really what we've come to, is making masks at home? And I said, yes, that is what we've come to, but it's not a low point, it's really adaptation. And now numerous studies, including modeling studies out of Texas and out of the UK, show us that masks have prevented hundreds of thousands of infections in the hardest hit places. And even a mask that's only 50% effective will flatten curves. And this is amplified greatly if people wear masks. So really the evidence has now come forth that distancing and sheltering is important, but the masks are essential, an essential component of this. And if you can get a substantial fraction of the population to wear masks a large fraction of the time, even before they develop symptoms, so that 3 to 4 day period where they may be asymptomatic, spreading to others. If people wear masks when they're in these kinds of environments, including population dense environments, crowded office places, crowded workplaces, et cetera, we can bring the transmissibility down below 1, and that then makes it a non-exponential growth, and the epidemic burns out. And so I feel that part of this national dialogue and part of what we can do is really encourage masks now and make sure that that becomes a part of the national seasonal strategy.
So you think that's even, because I was thinking about that just this week, even after COVID and when there is a vaccine, it could become during especially flu seasons and certain seasons, we should just guide everyone to wear masks? You think we might lean that way because you don't know when the next virus will come?
It's hard to make a national mandate on these sorts of things, as you know, and even a step above that, it is hard to direct individuals in this country, and there's a lot of autonomy in this country. We compare that to a lot of Asian countries that masked up at the first signs of this epidemic and had very low numbers. And so there certainly is a balance there, but I do believe that in coming seasons, masks will be a part of the social appearance and the optics of America. They just work so well, and people have gotten so used to them. And now there are stylish ones, and people are making their own, as I mentioned. And so I do think that it'll be fairly widespread. And I think during flu season, it can only help things. So less people with flu and other respiratory viruses during that season, not just COVID, would be beneficial to save lives kind of throughout. And there's very little downside other than the appearance. I think that now they're quite acquirable.
Rohini, are you seeing any sort of business plans with like masks and like fancy
see-through masks?
See-through masks. All right. There's a question around, I think the most popular question right now. I personally have not read the article, but I don't know, Atif or Abid, if you guys came across the article yesterday on the looming bank collapse.
Look, I mean, I haven't read the article either. I heard somebody commenting on it. So look, I don't want to speculate too much. My understanding is, well, yeah, exactly. Look, I went to MIT, so and I stayed a Holiday Inn last night. I believe the argument there was that if you have, similar to what happened to the CDOs back in 2008, that the CLOs are going to cause the same amount of damage to the general bank balance sheets. And I believe what that missed was that CDOs in their own right were dangerous, but it was a lot of the derivatives of the CDOs that caused a lot more damage to a lot of these bank balance sheets. Again, Atif is the one who's written the book on that entire topic, so who am I to speculate on that point? But my understanding is that that's the assertion, is that the CLOs can do to the balance sheet the same thing the CDOs do to the balance sheets, and I think that's a little bit of a stretch in my personal opinion.
Let me just say one thing. I think I'm going to make a more broader comment on these kind of concerns of financial collapse or financial crisis of the sort we saw in 2008 and so on. In general, I see a lower likelihood of something like that happening, which is not necessarily a good thing, by the way. But let me try to explain why I say that. The attitude of the big players, so think the Federal Reserve, central banks around the world, but also think, treasuries around the world. The attitudes, or China, for example, have drastically changed since 2008. If you remember, early on in the 2008 crisis, there was this Lehman moment when for a split second, the government said they will let the markets play out. And that quickly changed and so on. And the rest, sort of, as they say, is history. That view, and you know, you have to just read Bernanke's book, The Courage to Act, as he put it. The punchline of that is that, you know, we will just sort of bail out anyone and everyone to prevent a financial crisis because we just don't want to suffer through another one. So that's sort of the attitude. Now we can debate whether that's a good attitude or a bad attitude, but that is the attitude. And so what that means is that I don't think that a financial crisis, and by financial crisis, you know, we mean sort of, you know, financial institutions failing. That's sort of, you know, that's not going to happen, I think, because, you know, they'll just not allow it. But that has certain implications. And I think the one very important implication of that is that at the end of the day, when you put all your weaponry to prevent those kind of crises, that has one big cost. And that big cost is that the long-term interest rate will find it very hard to rise. And so going back to this comment earlier that Abid made of, you know, measure when the measure becomes the target, I very much agree with that. But to the extent there is a measure out there that you can look up to, I would say just focus on the 10-year rate, the 10-year treasury rate, because that's not something the Fed can directly control and so on and so forth. It's a little bit of a technical argument. But basically focus on that. And, you know, we know it's at historic lows, and if anything, it's keep getting lower and lower, and it's hard for it to go any lower at some level. But that's a bad sign. So if you want to think of one measure, you know, look at 10-year treasury, and until and unless that comes back to kind of some semblance of normal levels, you should know that the economy is not in a good place, regardless of what S&P is at. You know, that's another way of thinking about it. S&P can be infinite if the interest rate is zero. That's just the standard present value formula tells you that you know, when R is close to zero, you can justify prices of infinity. And that sort of is going to lead to a lot of volatility in financial markets. So we should just get used to this up and down 2 percentage points, 5 percentage points movements in the stock market. That's just going to be, you know, just the way we live, just like masks, just get used to that as well. But again, if you want a metric for economy coming from the financial markets, look at the 10-year rate. There's a lot of bad leverage in the system. There's no doubt about it. But you know what? When interest rates are zero, everyone can roll over endlessly. And that's the world essentially we are in at the macro level.
I mean, so Atif, I agree with you. I think the concern that I have is, you know, what you said is generally pretty widely believed in the investment community. And that in itself then feeds this moral hazard, right? Where we can go out further and further and further and take bigger and bigger and bigger risks, and somebody else will come and bail me out. And I think that's that's kind of a allocation of capital that at least I'm observing in the marketplace right now. You know, and you know, look, the four kind of most dangerous words in finance have always been "this time is different," right? It'll somehow find its way. Like Chairman Yellen had gone out and made what I would thought was a very brave assertion at one point, which said, you know, I don't think we'd see another financial crisis in our lifetimes. And obviously that's, I would argue, has already been proven wrong. The problem with what the Fed's doing, what a lot of the central banks are doing right now, is they're trying to manage a system. And as we all know, right, it's a little bit like a pillow, right? You push here, it'll pop up somewhere else. There will always be repercussions, right? No matter what, I mean, we can throw a lot of money at the problem right now, but if that ends up with 40 trillion, debt load on this country, at some point that will have implications, right? What implications does it have? Does it have implications on the US dollar? Does it have implications on inflation? Maybe all, both, maybe more aspects. So it's a pretty dangerous game that the central banks are playing, in my opinion. And it's, as I said earlier, is directing a lot of misallocation of capital in this current economy.
So it is a very dangerous game. I completely agree with the description. At the societal level, it's basically a question of there's a key choice that has to be made. One choice is that you do what you're doing, like the way central banks are behaving and all of that. That's one choice, and we have kind of obviously taken that choice at a societal level. If you want to move away from that and get rid of the costs that Avid is talking about, then you have to make a second choice. But that second choice is It's a lot of hard work. So what is that second choice? That second choice means that you have to move towards certain structural reforms to rebalance the economy. And so that requires that you will have to address, some of the inequities and so on that many have already pointed out. That means you will have to take some politically difficult decisions. Actually, not difficult in terms of there's a lot of public support behind it, but it's being stopped in important quarters. For example, things like the wealth tax. I don't have time to technically go into it, but if you study this system, the dynamics of this system that we are just describing, one way to resolve this is to make those kind of hard choices. We have to rewire the economy in a different way, and that does require structural reforms of a sort that will require a great new deal, so to speak, at different margins. And so we are really at that important point, and the usual state of affairs will just not cut it anymore, and that's a realization our politicians will be facing in the next few years down the road.
So Atif, there are one clarifying question people have asked. When you talk about the 10-year rate, are you talking about the 10-year nominal rates, 10-year real yields? What specifically are you talking about over there?
Yeah, good question. These days, there's not a big difference between the two conceptually because inflation expectations are reasonably anchored, number one. And so you could look at the nominal or the real and, you kind of get the same picture. Obviously, the real tends to be lower than the nominal. But inflation is pretty stable and unlikely to rise. So because, again, the reason for that is to go back to what I was saying earlier, that the big push has been this downward pressure on aggregate demand, that people are trying to save too much. So you can even look at it from the more recent inflation numbers, that if anything, this COVID crisis has had a deflationary impact on the economy. And that continues to be kind of the dominant force at the macro level. So inflation expectations are, despite zero interest rates and everything else that the Fed has done, inflation expectations remain very low for all of these kind of, and it's not a good thing. Again, you don't want hyperinflation, of course, but this is a symptom of the underlying structural disease that we have, that there is, that we are in this constant kind of deflationary environment at some level. So that's not a good thing. But again, in terms of what I said about the 10-year, you could look at the nominal or the real, it will give you the same answer. So it doesn't really matter from that perspective.
Cool. So we've got 5 minutes left. So I'm just
I was going to add from a corporate
sorry.
Yeah, I was going to add something that was interesting from a corporate standpoint, is that it's also going to be interesting to see how right now a lot of the job losses have been less in large corporates and much more in the small businesses and other pieces. So I think it'll be interesting, even though there's been so much stimulus, what happens the second half when companies feel like they've had enough of a spread from when the crisis hit, that then they're going to make actions, and that second half, I don't know if it's been baked into a lot of what's happening in the market either.
Yeah. No, and I was going to add, Shuja, that there was a question earlier about the MIT community and so on. One of the things that has been very interesting, and this call is interesting because we've all had to think about things in a system dynamics oriented way, and hopefully all of us took systems dynamics class at MIT, because I'll give you an example from the venture world. Like we talked about maybe in the last call, that there is $150 billion of cash waiting in the wings at venture. And so historically, if you looked at historic recessions and downturns, you say, okay, that's pretty good in the venture world, that things are going to come back. But on the other hand, things like PPP, they dwarf, 150 billion is dwarfed by what the government is doing. So I can control my actions here, but like there might be something so much bigger going on in the government world that I have no control over. And similarly, like we're all, now amateur epidemiologists trying to figure out, okay, is this going to be open? Is this closed? So it's really good to have, Sudev here and Atif here, giving us insights into it, because in some ways we have to be generalists again. We really need to be able to take in a lot of different subject matter inputs and then translate that to how it influences our little corner of the business world.
No, absolutely. And I think that was the intent of this particular session, because we're all trying to figure out what's happening and leveraging our MIT networks to bring in experts to help make sense out of this madness. I have one parting question, Atif. It's like, why are all these recoveries shaped or named after alphabets? Why is it a U shape and a V shape? You don't have to answer it, but yeah. Anyways,
no, we like to summarize things, right? That's human nature. So you want to summarize a complex thing into one number or one alphabet in this case.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. We're now up to the top of our hour, and we'll reconvene same time next week. So please send in your questions, and we'll try and narrow in another theme for next year. And so until then, have a good weekend and stay safe.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Take care.
Bye, guys.